So many people think the medieval era was considered to be a dark and irrational time with primitive people who had no idea about technologies and were hopelessly superstitious. What a myth! Historians across the world have spent years and years trying to prove people were different then. This false story spread probably because some people complained about the quality of literature from that time and claimed they couldn't find the historical sources they needed. In reality, the Middle Ages was anything but dark. It was a pretty cool time of philosophy, innovation, and works of art that became legendary. That's when eyeglasses came into the game. It was a time of progress with inventions such as movable type, heavy plows, and mechanical timekeeping. These three things later set the base for the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. It was a great time for artists too. Guilds helped them rise from humble backgrounds. They could master different forms of art, such as tapestry, illuminated manuscripts, and sculptures. They kinda set the stage for the Renaissance, and things weren't just happening in Europe. China worked on navigation and perfected the compass. African kingdoms engaged in complex trade, and civilizations thrived across the Americas. All people from the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat. Nope. Literally, all medieval scholars thought our planet was a sphere. Well, it's just that they believed it was perfectly round, while now we know it's slightly elliptical. One scholar even managed to figure out the radius of our planet using mathematics, and he was off only by 19 miles. In the 19th century, everyone spread the word about how those who lived in medieval times thought our planet was a flat board because it seemed like a good example of how backwards they were. Many blame a very popular American writer from that time, Washington Irving. He wrote a book that was read like a biography of Christopher Columbus, even though it was mostly fiction. And one of those made-up sections even mentioned so-called experts who claimed the Earth was flat. Medieval people did not really live past 30 years old. That's not completely false, it's just that most people interpret it the wrong way. This doesn't mean someone was considered old or had one foot in the grave after they turned 30. If a person from those times managed to reach adulthood, they often lived to be 60 or 70 years old. No one thought they were old until they turned at least 50. It's just that life expectancy rates were way lower back then because people had fewer chances to survive in the earliest years of their lives. There were lots of diseases they couldn't cure, like we can these days. People from the Dark Ages were filthy most of the time. So not true. Sure, they didn't really understand that germs cause diseases like people from the 19th century did. But the common story that they didn't wash themselves and were constantly dirty doesn't hold water. In reality, they enjoyed taking baths both outdoors and indoors. They made and used soap at home, but also loved to visit bathhouses. Toothbrushes existed only in medieval China. But people in Europe kept their teeth clean with a cloth. They would occasionally use natural remedies so their breath was fresh and their teeth remained white. Back then, people even had hand-washing rituals before meals, especially those who were rich. It's not that peasants didn't wash their hands, but those from aristocratic circles used lavish lavatories, and minstrels would sing them a song while they were washing their hands. If those rich fellas were dining with the king, they would wait for him to wash his hands before sitting down. That's how they would show him he was powerful and important. Many historians think such traditions started to fade around the 16th century when people began using forks instead of their cleaned fingers. This takes us to the next one. Medieval people didn't use cutlery. That's another myth. They did eat some things using their fingers, but not everything. Spoons and knives were pretty common, and the invention of the fork goes all the way back to the 4th century in the Byzantine Empire. In the 11th century, forks were a common thing in Italy. Plus, other European countries started adding them as part of their tableware as well. People didn't travel back in the Middle Ages. Nope, not really. It's not like they were born, grew up, and passed away without ever leaving one place. Of course, they didn't have the same ways to travel like we have today, but there are still plenty of records that show that many people traveled around. They would even move to other places across their country. Humans are curious to get to know the world around them, no matter what time they lived in. Peasants across Europe would visit monasteries and churches, or would go on pilgrimages, whether those were in their country or overseas. Medieval knights were very slow because of their heavy armor. Now that's a misconception. Mark Twain had a fun book called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. His main character lives in the 19th century, but after a fight, he loses consciousness and wakes up in medieval England at the time of King Arthur. This book also became the source of many misconceptions people in the US had about medieval times. Twain described how this guy was running in circles around a knight who had trouble even moving under his heavy armor. This idea is funny, but it's not actually true. Knights wouldn't have been able to go into battles or do much of anything if their armor had really been such a burden, turning them into turtles. High-quality plate armor from those times weighed up to 60 pounds max. It was distributed well across the body of a man who had been preparing for the battlefield for almost his whole life. So, a knight in his armor could climb, run, and perform the rest of the athletic activities with only a couple of restrictions. And no, witch trials were not that common in medieval times. They did occur to some extent, but most of these stories are exaggerated. Up to the 14th century, the world didn't know or think too much about the idea of witchcraft and witches. But as the Middle Ages were coming to an end, some started having ideas that certain people were working with demons and dark magic. There are official records of witch trials and even certain books that talked about the dangers of them. But this craze about witchcraft was something that mostly happened between the 16th and 18th centuries in North American and European societies. That was the time when tens of thousands of people were accused of being witches and faced the worst destiny for that. Fear of that remains even today. But there are more chances for people to face their end after being accused of witchcraft now in the 21st century than in the whole Middle Ages. Many believed doctors had worn strange outfits back in the Middle Ages. You've probably seen the Halloween costume called the Medieval Plague Doctor. It's a pretty weird and even a bit scary leather outfit with a mask that has a big beak. The descriptions mostly explain how doctors would wear this as a protection back in the mid-14th century when the Black Death struck Europe. It's just that no one wore it in medieval times, though. This outfit wasn't drawn or mentioned until the 17th century. Some doctors in France and Italy might have used it for a while, but after everyone started mocking them, they probably just gave up.
That's it for today. So hey, if you pacified your curiosity, then give the video a like and share it with your friends. Or if you want more, just click on these videos and stay on the bright side.